Almost all healthcare facilities generate regulated medical waste, pharmaceutical waste, and other healthcare waste. This presentation will provide an overview of regulated medical waste so that you will feel confident about where to place the waste generated in your office or facility. The objective for this presentation is to provide you with the information you need to understand how to properly identify waste streams and to properly handle the most common healthcare-associated regulated wastes. First, we will provide a short overview, and then we will discuss the importance of properly identifying and segregating different waste streams. We will discuss managing regulated medical waste collection and storage. Next, we will discuss labeling and documentation for transport of regulated medical waste, including certain U.S. Department of Transportation requirements governing regulated medical waste being transported on public roads. We will point out several other healthcare-associated wastes and provide a summary. The handling of regulated medical waste and other special wastes in your office is strictly regulated by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, whether your office is in a state covered by federal OSHA or in a state with its own OSHA state plan. Other federal agencies, such as the Department of Transportation, the Environmental Protection Agency, and, depending on the state involved, various individual state authorities also have regulations governing the training, handling, storage, packaging, transportation, treatment, and final disposal of regulated medical waste and other hazardous materials and hazardous waste. Identification and segregation of waste for healthcare facilities begins with regulated medical waste. This is the biohazardous waste that is placed in the familiar red bags or red sharps containers. The first thing to realize about regulated medical waste is that it is not the same thing as refuse or trash. Every healthcare office or facility generates solid waste that does not fall into the category of special wastes. This regular type of waste, or trash, is what is referred to as municipal solid waste. Just exactly what is regulated medical waste? Each state has its own particular definition, and there is some variance depending on your particular location. Fortunately, however, there is one source we can turn to for a general definition, and that source is federal OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The federal OSHA definition used for regulated medical waste serves as a basic guide. OSHA generates its rules in documents that are referred to as standards. An OSHA standard is not simply a recommendation or a guideline. OSHA standards carry the full force of law. One particular OSHA standard that greatly impacts healthcare workers is, of course, the Bloodborne Pathogens Standard. The federal OSHA Bloodborne Pathogens Standard begins with a series of definitions. The definition provided therein for regulated medical waste is: regulated waste means liquid or semi-liquid blood or other potentially infectious materials. Contaminated items that would release blood or other potentially infectious materials in a liquid or semi-liquid state if compressed. Items that are caked with dried blood or other potentially infectious materials and are capable of releasing these materials during handling. Contaminated sharps, and pathological and microbiological wastes containing blood or other potentially infectious materials. What exactly are other potentially infectious materials? The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention uses a guideline called Standard Precautions for Protection from Bloodborne Pathogens. Basically, according to the CDC concept of what is referred to as standard precautions, the guideline applies not just to blood, but to most body fluids other than blood. Body fluids other than blood itself are examples of other potentially infectious materials. Standard precautions, therefore, recommends treating not just blood, but most other body fluids as well as being potentially infectious. The following are required to go into a regulated medical waste red bag: visibly bloody gloves, visibly bloody plastic tubing, visibly contaminated PPE, saturated gauze, saturated bandages, blood-saturated items, closed disposable sharps containers. Many facilities choose to go beyond these strict minimum requirements, however, and consider all items contaminated with any blood or OPIM whatsoever as being regulated medical waste. Two other forms of regulated medical waste are pathological waste and trace chemotherapeutic waste. But these types of regulated medical waste are segregated and marked for incineration. What does not belong in the regulated medical waste red bag? The items listed here: compressed gas cylinders, batteries, cauterizers, loose sharps, hazardous and chemical waste, radioactive waste, garbage and municipal solid waste, and fixatives and preservatives. Pharmaceuticals, that is, medications, do not belong in the red bag. No state permits hazardous pharmaceutical waste to be placed in the red bag. Now you can see why municipal solid waste should never be mixed or commingled with regulated medical waste. Regulated medical waste is handled in a much more controlled fashion than municipal solid waste, and if these two different types of wastes are mixed together, then the entire batch of waste must be treated as the most serious category. In other words, if just a small amount of regulated medical waste is mixed in with municipal solid waste, then the entire amount of waste must be handled as regulated medical waste. What kind of container is required for regulated medical waste? OSHA requires that regulated medical waste containers be closable, so that means a lid or some other means of closure is required. In addition, both a color-coded bag, that is, a red bag, and a biohazard symbol are required by some states and recommended for all states. Stericycle may accept sharps only in a Food and Drug Administration approved sharps container. Homemade sharps containers are not permitted. A sharp has two characteristics. One, it is capable of penetrating or cutting the skin. And two, it is potentially contaminated. Here we see some examples of items considered to be sharps if they have been contaminated, that is, used with a patient. This list is not all-inclusive. Each state has its own unique definition of a sharp, in addition to federal DOT and OSHA. Some states, for example, require unused, uncontaminated sharps to still be handled as regulated medical waste sharps. Sharps containers are required to be readily available and accessible at the point where the sharp is generated, so that the sharp may be immediately placed into the sharps container. Sharps containers are to be closed securely and placed directly into the red bag in the transport container, also called the secondary or shipping container. There are some sharps containers, those that are typically used in larger healthcare facilities, which are called gasketed sharps containers. These types of sharps containers do not require a secondary container, the transport or shipping carton or container. The second photo shows an example of a gasketed lid for this type of container. The gasket is the black material you can see around the perimeter of the inside of the lid. The requirements for storage of medical waste vary from state to state. Be sure to check your particular state's information that can be accessed on the state-specific tab for this training. One very important function for preparing medical waste for transport is the packaging. For disposable cardboard containers, we first tape the bottom of the box, and then we place a red bag into the container. Smaller red bags, such as those from an exam room or operatory, are to be tied off, and sharps containers are to be properly closed before they are placed into the red bag inside the disposable cardboard transport container. Some states require each individual red bag and sharps container to be labeled with the generator's name and address. Check your own state's regulations to be sure about any variances on bag thickness and other properties, or how many bags must be used, and so forth. The container's inner red bag is then tied off. The container is closed and sealed, and we make sure that the required markings are present on the container. We will cover what specific markings are required later in the presentation. For reusable transport containers, the packaging is similar. Place the red bag inside the container. Place the smaller tied-off red bags and properly closed sharps containers inside the reusable container's red bag. Tie off the reusable container's red bag. Close and secure the top. Make sure the required markings are present. Some examples of non-acceptable containers are any of the things listed on the slide. Stericycle can never accept improperly packaged containers for transportation. Individual state requirements vary for maximum weight allowed. Check individual state information for specifics, and be sure to never exceed limits. As mentioned previously, both pathological waste and trace chemo waste are considered to be regulated medical waste that is individually segregated and marked for incineration. Neither of them is placed in the usual red bag waste. Trace chemotherapeutic waste. Trace chemo is collected in color-coded yellow containers. What we mean by trace chemo are such things as chemo containers, IV tubing, syringes, and so forth that are empty or in which only a trace amount of material remains. Trace amount is defined as being less than 3% of the original contents by weight. And some forms of chemo, what are called EPA P-listed items, can never be considered trace chemo if there is any amount whatsoever remaining in the container. Certain things are required by the Department of Transportation for the shipping papers or manifests for regulated medical waste. The DOT's requirements are identified here. All hazardous materials must be accompanied by a hazardous material shipping paper or a manifest. Documentation must be complete and correct, and it must include the generator's signature. The U.S. DOT requires that waste is properly identified and packaged to keep it safe during transport. Every container must be securely closed. The DOT requires that anyone who prepares regulated medical waste for transport or anyone preparing and signing the shipping papers must be properly trained on the hazardous materials regulations. It is important to note that this waste segregation training is not the same thing as the required DOT hazmat training. For a regulated medical waste transport container, DOT requires certain other markings to be present, and Stericycle has all of that information already on its containers. 5 specific items are required by DOT. 1. Regulated medical waste, NOS. 2. UN 3291. 3. Biohazard symbol. 4. The word biohazard. And 5. Arrows facing up. Keep in mind that individual states may also have their own additional requirements. Some states, for example, may require Spanish to also be used. As previously noted, pathological and trace chemotherapy waste, although still considered to be a regulated medical waste, is segregated into a container marked appropriately to identify it, and also marked for incineration only. Some states use their own government-issued manifests, while in other states, the Stericycle driver is able to generate a form with an electronic device at the time of pickup. The shipper's signature is not just a casual signing. By signing the manifest, the shipper is certifying to the DOT that everything inside the container is properly described, packaged, marked, and labeled in accordance with DOT regulations, and that the quantities, volumes, and other specifics listed are correct. Please note that it is not Stericycle who characterizes the waste. Proper characterization is defined by DOT as always remaining the generator's responsibility. The secondary regulated medical waste container, the outer container, must have the information listed on this slide on the outside of the container. Some individual states have additional requirements beyond those of DOT for what must be listed. There are still other waste streams present in some healthcare facilities. Controlled substances, for example, must be exactly that, controlled at all times. This type of waste has to be handled and disposed of separately. Controlled substances are products listed on Schedules 1 through 5 of Title 21 United States Code Controlled Substances Act. Examples include opiates, morphine and codeine, muscle relaxants, depressants, and stimulants, amphetamines. In cases with controlled substances, Stericycle recommends the SteriPack program as a means DEA registrants may use for disposal. Contact SteriPack telephone number 877-546-8411 or find out more at the website shown on the slide. You may also contact the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration office nearest you for proper advice on disposal of controlled substances. A listing of DEA contact information for all states is available at the web link shown on the slide. Some healthcare facilities also generate film processing chemicals, such as fixer and developer. Other items, such as lead foil, mercury, amalgam, and radioactive waste, may also be generated. All of these materials must be handled separately and cannot be placed in regulated medical waste. Some of them may have reclamation value, and any items being sent for reclamation should not be placed in hazardous waste containers since they are not waste. In the case of radioactive waste, it is important to note that this type of waste is often mistakenly placed with regulated medical waste, even though its time in the holding area at the generator was not long enough to decay past background levels for radiation. Stericycle screens for radioactive waste at all treatment locations. Waste identified to be above the allowable limits of the facility must be returned to the generator. It is important to ensure that you understand your responsibility for proper screening prior to releasing this waste. Some radioactive waste remains hazardous waste even after its radioactive emission has decayed to background levels, due to the fact that it may contain materials that are hazardous waste for other reasons. An example is radioactive waste containing uranyl nitrate that is a characteristic hazardous waste in its own right, even though it may have already decayed to background levels. This biohazardous waste presentation has provided a basic overview of regulated medical waste. Individual states, however, have their own specific regulations that vary. Be sure, therefore, to also see the state-specific information provided by our program for the regulations applicable in your state. Be sure to also visit the website noted on the slide to access the regulations for your own state. If you have other questions, please feel free to email them to drugdisposalquestion@stericycle.com. As we have seen, every aspect of regulated medical waste is carefully regulated. It is important, therefore, to properly identify and separate or segregate the various types of wastes generated in your office and/or facility so that they do not become commingled. This concludes the general overview presentation. Be sure now to refer to the state-specific tab for your specific requirements. Thank you for your kind attention.